Today I'm here to talk to you about some of my favorite pieces of gear for astrophotography. So I have the Sony A7S III. This camera came out last year, and I got my hands on one of my very own in February. And as many of you know, it was my dream camera. And I have two lenses with me that I want to talk to you about that are so good for astrophotography. The one that I have mounted to my camera is the 14mm f1.8 G Master. And this one, I haven't had a ton of time with it. I have been able to use it for some night stuff. It is an absolutely beautiful lens, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that. And then the other one that I have with me is the 12-24 f2.8 G Master. This lens is my favorite lens by far, and I always have it with me. I've had it since February, and it has not left one of my cameras. So I typically have two camera bodies with me, and my 12-24 lives on one of my camera bodies. It's quite literally my favorite lens ever that I've ever used. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about night photography and what I do, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this camera and what makes it really special for night photography. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the lenses and when I use them and why I might choose a 14 over the 12-24. And if you see me batting at my face a lot, it's because there are a ton of mosquitoes here and they are making brunch out of me. So typically when people think about night photography, they automatically think about the Milky Way. And I do love Milky Way shooting. It is absolutely one of my very favorite times of the night. But I think about night photography as so much more. Night photography is anything that we're going to do in low light under the stars, basically. And so that can be moonlight, it can be aurora shooting, it can be Milky Way. My very, very, very favorite kind of light is when the moon is full and low on the horizon, and there's enough clouds that the clouds reflect the moonlight during astronomical twilight. So it's a very, very specific set of conditions. I'm actually hoping to chase that tonight and use the Sony A7S III with the 14mm out here in Glacier National Park to capture that really special kind of light. But basically what that does is it kind of, because it's astronomical twilight, you get a lot of those pink tones, because even though the sun is below the horizon, there's still some of that color from the sun left in the sky in the clouds. And then when the moon rises and it's really low on the horizon, just like when the sun is low on the horizon, that light reflects up and will underlight the clouds. And all the while, we also get to see stars, and the stars are faint. It's not like we get to see a full Milky Way, but it's a really special kind of light, and it only happens a few times a month to get all the right conditions, with the moon being at the right elevation and during the right time of night and getting the right kind of illumination with the right kind of clouds. It's really, really specific, but it is one of my very favorite types of light. Another type of night shooting that I am just totally, completely gaga over is aurora shooting. And the aurora has been getting stronger. We are moving out of solar minimum for any of you astro nerds out there, and we're moving towards solar maximum. And that means that there's more and more activity on the sun, and we're getting more and more aurora events because of that. So shooting the northern lights is another one of my favorite times to photograph the night sky. And for shooting something like the aurora, this 14mm f1.8 is going to be so ideal because it's a fast lens and it's going to let lots of light in. And that means that we're going to be able to take short shutters and capture the movement of the aurora, because if we just leave the shutter open for 15 seconds, the aurora is going to move and dance through the whole scene, and it's just going to look like a green smear. But when we can take shorter shutters, we can capture the movement, all the ribbons and the pillars and the different colors, and so being able to shoot on a fast lens is really, really important. When I'm shooting aurora, I like to think again about the scene as a whole. I'm an Astro landscape photographer, and that means I'm always looking at the landscape. I'm looking at those details that help to draw the eye into the frame and make a person wish that they could go and see or photograph that place. And the sky, the night sky, whether it's aurora or moonlight or Milky Way, that's just the feeling that I get to capture, and it's part of the landscape. So I'm always thinking about all of these things all at once. And night shooting it changes every single night because the conditions change every single night. So we might have more or less moonlight to work with. The moon is going to be higher or lower on the horizon, which is going to affect the shadows and the harshness or softness of the light. And it doesn't matter if I go and visit the exact same place 100 nights in a row, I am never going to get the exact same photograph because the conditions are going to change. The light is always changing. And, you know, Milky Way doesn't change a lot, but how we photograph it has changed a lot. And using cameras like the A7S III that's so light sensitive, and these fast lenses and high ISOs and all the ways that we have to process that now, we can see so much more detail than we've ever been able to see in the Milky Way. So night photography is like it's just fascinating because it changes all the time, and the light changes all the time, and there's some really beautiful things to get out there and photograph, and having the right gear is going to make all the difference in the world. This sweet little camera here, this Sony A7S III, is a 12 megapixel camera. And when people hear that, they tend to think, oh, that's not enough resolution, because that's pretty low compared to like the R line or the A1, which I also have, the A1 being 50 megapixels, and the R I think goes up to 62 megapixels. So that's a lot of resolution. But what makes this camera really, really special is that with that low resolution, each pixel on the same size of sensor, so this camera has the same size of sensor as my A1, each pixel is larger and can gather more light. And that makes it a low light monster. And actually, my very first Sony camera was the A7S Mark I. It is what turned me on to Sony in the first place. I had been doing engagement photos and working with people under the stars. And my goal was to get a camera that could really handle that low light and that I could get short exposures, because I don't know if you've ever tried to ask somebody to hold still for a long exposure, but it is really difficult. It's a lot more difficult than you might imagine. I am the world's worst subject when trying to do any kind of long exposure. I try, but the minute I know the camera is on me and that I have to hold still, I feel like a tree swaying in the wind, and I'm pretty tall and I cannot hold still. So when I started taking pictures of couples under the stars, I needed a camera that could do shorter exposures and still get good light and still get the landscape and still get the stars. And that's what turned me on to the A7S in the very first place. And to have the Mark III come out was really a dream come true for me, because it's got all of the latest Sony firmware updates. It does everything that all of my other cameras do. It has the Z battery, which is really, really good. It lasts a really long time. I can shoot in extremely cold temperatures with this for 6 hours, 1800 frames of time lapse, and the battery never gives out, even in really cold temps. So the autofocus system is really great. It's not something I use a ton of because I use this for night photography, but there's some other really, really cool features of this camera that make it so amazing for night photos. So first of all, as I mentioned, those larger pixels, those 12 megapixels, they gather so much light. And this camera handles high ISO really well. So I can shoot something at ISO 6400 and it looks pretty clean. Like the file, you can see there's a bit of noise in it, but it looks pretty clean. So a single file at ISO 6400 is gonna look pretty good. Some of my other favorite features of this is Sony has a function called bright monitoring. It's something that you have to program onto the camera in the first place. So I typically have it programmed for my C2 button right up here on the top. It's something that I like having it on a button that I can feel in the middle of the night, even if I have gloves on, so that I don't have to turn lights on to find my way around my camera. So what bright monitoring does is it allows me to it kind of boosts the internal gain of the camera, and it's like turning on night vision, so my camera can see in the dark. And that means that I can quickly and easily find compositions. I can actually see the core of the Milky Way, how it lines up in my photo, and how the whole alignment of the photo is looking. Another function that I absolutely love on a Sony camera, and it's on the Sony A7S III as well, is that it has a little focus scale on the back. So when you're focusing at night, you can find your focus on your star, for example, or find your focus on your near ground using a flashlight. And the scale will tell you where you're focused. So the scale goes as low as 0.3 of a meter, or 0.3 m, I assume that's a meter, and it goes up to infinity. So if I'm focused on a star at infinity, but I need to focus stack my foreground and I have nothing that I can see that I can focus on, all I have to do is turn the focus wheel back from infinity after I find focus on my star. And so if I'm turning it back towards the foreground, I'm turning it to the right, and I'll find the next stop there. And then I find another stop, and then I go closer, 5 meters. And as I get closer to the camera, 3 meters, 2 meters, 1 meter, then I can start going less than 1 meter. And I can go 0.9, 0.8, 0.7, 0.6, 0.5, all the way down to 0.3. And that means that I can cover the full range of focus at any aperture and be able to focus stack completely without being able to actually see what I'm focusing on. So that little focus scale on the back is a real game changer at night if you're trying to focus in the dark and you need to focus stack something. So I want to show you another very cool feature that Sony has come out with. They have the Sony Commander remote, and this is going to allow you to focus stack at night without being able to see where you're focusing. So let's imagine we're shooting at f2.8, like I've got my camera set here, and I've got something really low and close in the foreground, and to get the Milky Way sharp and that foreground object sharp, I'm gonna have to focus stack. So first of all, I just find my near focal point, and I can do that by focusing with a flashlight, and then all I have to do is hit click and the camera will take the first shot. Then I want to make sure that the camera is in manual focus and the lens is in autofocus. Then all I have to do is use the plus button, and you can see the little focus scale just shifted on the camera. Take a shot. So if I hit the plus button again, I'm moving towards infinity. Take another shot, hit that plus button again. You can see I'm now focused a meter away. Hit the plus button again, 2 meters, and so on until I get to infinity. And that's my focus stack. I would take one more shot where I manually focus on the stars just to make sure I've nailed it, but that would allow me to get that full range without being able to see where I'm focusing. How cool is that? So I've talked to you about bright monitoring, which allows me to find a composition quickly and easily. I've talked to you about the focus scale, which allows me to basically focus blind. Another feature that I use is, and this is on most cameras, is focus magnification. So when I'm focusing, I have focus magnification set up on one of my back buttons here, and this allows me to punch in and magnify that star and find focus on it. And when I'm focusing on the A7S III on one of these wide-angle lenses, I can actually see little diffraction spikes on my stars. And so that's a pretty cool feature of this camera as well. So given that the camera is so light sensitive and handles high ISO so well, it's really allowed me to get more creative with my night shooting. So I've been working on doing nighttime cinemagraphs, and that would be having one part of the image hold still while other parts of the image move. And I have photographed couples in dancing poses and have the Milky Way move across the background. So this camera has really allowed me to get more creative with my night shooting just because it is so light sensitive. And as a time-lapse camera, it's absolutely fantastic because, for one thing, it has interval shooting built into it, so I can use that interval shooting to either, you know, set it to take a few shots and I can go and try and stand in my own frame, which is next to impossible. I can set it to take 20 shots and I can stack those at high ISO for noise reduction when I'm shooting the stars. And I can use it to do time-lapsing. And all of my time-lapsing I can control within the camera. So that makes it really amazing. But to be able to time-lapse at night and get a really good exposure using higher ISOs, and still getting the stars, not having to have the camera open for 30 seconds to get a good exposure on the landscape, but still getting, you know, good exposure on the stars is really, really amazing. So shooting at higher ISOs allows me to get those shorter shutter times for stars and for people, and really take my night shooting to a whole other level. Okay, so as I mentioned, I have the 14mm with me, and I've had a chance to test this one out. I love this lens. This is an absolutely super sharp lens, and it also goes down to f1.8, which is really fast, and I can do super short exposures, and prime lenses are always going to be sharper for night photography than a zoom lens. Now, I love my 12-24. It doesn't leave one of my camera bodies, typically ever. The 12-24 is an extremely sharp lens. It does have a little bit of elongation in the corners because it is so very wide. So the 14 has a little less of that elongation. It's much, much sharper, and it's faster. So it's a 1.8 compared to a 2.8. This lens is going to be awesome for any kind of aurora shooting. When you have a fast shutter, you can capture the movement of the aurora really well and still get, again, your landscape really well exposed. Combine that with a focus scale and be able to focus stack your foreground really quickly and easily is also a huge plus. So it's really hard for me to tell you when would be a good time to use the 14mm and when would be a good time to use the 12-24, but I'll tell you when I do it. So the 12-24, like I said, it's a super versatile lens just because of the zoom range on it, and it is very, very sharp. That little bit of elongation that I get in the corners, nobody's ever going to really see that when I'm posting my photos online or if I'm using them as part of a time lapse. When we time lapse, the motion of the stars moving by makes them look more like what we would expect them to look like. So it kind of obscures that little bit of elongation. The 14 is going to be faster, is going to be better for things like aurora shooting. It's going to be better if I know I just want to be wide and fast. It's definitely going to be better if I'm hiking. So I do a lot of hiking, and although I love the versatility of the 12-24, it is a heavier lens, where this one is very, very small. So as you can see, the 12-24 is much bigger. It's fairly weighty. So if I know I'm going to be shooting wide and I'm hiking, I'm definitely going to opt for the smaller, lighter lens. But if I'm looking for the versatility, or if I'm only going to take one lens with me, then maybe the 12-24 would be a better choice. I will be traveling to the Yukon here shortly in the next few weeks, and I plan on taking them both with me. The reason being is that I know I'm going to be shooting aurora. I know that I'm going to be spending a lot of time up there. I'm backpacking in, and I'm actually going to take the 12-24, the 24-105, and the 100-400, and then I will take one prime lens with me for shooting Astro, and that's going to be the 14mm. It's going to, both of them are going to serve me really, really well. Mosquitoes. Both of them are going to serve me really well for, you know, shooting those grand landscapes. The Tombstone Mountains are so beautiful, and they're massive. So a wide angle lens is great because it's going to allow me to fit so much of the scene in. That's not my only favorite part of a wide angle lens. I do a lot of wide angle lens shooting, and it's because when you use a wide angle lens, this convex shape creates a little bit of distortion. And I use that distortion to help me find compositions. So when if I angle this lens down just a little bit, everything that is at the outer edges of the frame is going to pull the eye into the center. And that's because of that built-in distortion. The distortion is something that we actually pay for. We love distortion as landscape photographers because it means that you can get really low and close to some small little detail in the foreground, and you can make it look big and massive. So a tiny little crack in the rocks can look like a big chasm. And because of that built-in distortion and how the lens naturally draws the eye to the center of the frame, it helps to create really unique perspectives. And anytime that I'm shooting and creating any photograph, I'm always trying to change the viewer's perspective. You know, typically when we're walking around, when we're hiking, we are experiencing the world at eye level, and we see the world at eye level. And when we can get down low and close to our foreground with a wide angle lens, we're changing the viewer's perspective. We're showing them something novel that they haven't seen before. When we get really close to flowers or to frost flowers, we create that big to small transition that moves through the image. And so these big, beautiful flowers that are right next to the lens transition out to smaller and smaller and smaller as we move towards the horizon. And that gives the viewer a sense of 3D, a sense of depth. And so all of these things combined, that distortion that's built into our wide angle lenses, that helps to create images that are novel, and they're going to hold people's attention a lot longer. So for any kind of astro landscape, which is what I love to do, I try to think about that the night sky is just like a sunrise or a sunset. I always try to have the image really balanced, and I try to include enough foreground, midground, and background that there's places for the viewer's eye to travel through the frame. I really want to create and capture something unique and novel that's going to hold their attention longer. And wide angle shooting really offers lots of possibilities for creating unique images. I'm going to be around after the talk today, so I hope that you will all join me there and ask me lots of questions. I am a full Astro nerd, so you're also welcome to message me online anytime. My Instagram is Rachel Jones Ross, and you can also find me on Facebook with the same handle. My website is astralistphotography.com, and there you can learn more about my workshops and the courses that I teach. I also offer some online courses. And thank you all very much for joining me.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Be Alpha Live. I'm Christopher Robinson, editor of alphauniverse.com and host of the Alpha Universe podcast. And I'm joined live by Rachel Jones Ross. Rachel, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's so nice to see you again, Chris.
Likewise. Rachel, thanks so much for that great presentation. We are live with you, and we have a lot of questions that have come in. Please feel free to submit whatever questions you might have in the chat. We'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. Rachel, I want to start our Q&A session just by asking a little bit about focus stacking. You mentioned focus stacking in the presentation, but can you explain a little bit more about your focus stacking technique and why you do it?
Okay, that's a great question. So I love getting all kinds of detail and clarity throughout the image. So when I'm very close up on a subject, I don't have always the depth of field, even if I'm shooting at f/22 to get my foreground object in focus and the night sky at the same time. And obviously, when we're doing night shooting, we have to usually shoot at really wide open apertures, which means a shallow depth of field. And if I'm out there shooting at f/2.8 and it's a super shallow depth of field, there's going to be something in my image that isn't in focus. So what I do then is I take multiple images, and the only thing that changes from image to image is that I'm going to change where I'm putting my focus point. So the focus point will either start at the stars and work towards the foreground, or it can start at the foreground and work toward the stars. It doesn't really matter in what direction you work, as long as you're, getting that light that's there. If there's a lot of things happening in the sky, I'll start with the sky. So let's imagine there's an aurora, and I want to capture that movement and make sure I have a good sky shot before I start focus stacking my foreground. I'll make sure I get the sky first. So the direction's not really important. I do try to work methodically, although sometimes that kind of goes out the window when I get excited, but I try to work from front to back or back to front. And yeah, it's just taking a series of images and making sure that each plane of focus has nice sharp focus, and then combining all of those images together in post so that the viewer gets to see everything that I get to see when I'm out there.
Rachel, in the presentation, you were talking about using manual focus in the camera, I think, and autofocus in the lens. Can you explain that more? Was I hearing that correctly?
Okay, yeah. So there's lots of different ways that you can focus stack. So you can do that manually. You can set your manual focus and you can choose your focal point, and then you can adjust the lens, you know, that tiny little bit at a time, and make sure that you have focus. And often at night, that's what we need to do. But if it's really dark, how do you focus on your midground? So the tips that I gave in the presentation were ways that you can kind of get around, ways of getting around not being able to see. Because when we set the camera for a long exposure, the camera can see better than we can, obviously. So there's two different methods that I talked about in the video. One is to use the focus scale that's on the back of the camera. So when you're in manual focus and you adjust the focus wheel, then you're going to see the scale on the back of the camera shift. And there's a little, I think there's like a little mountain or a flower on one end, and there's an infinity symbol on the other end. So if you start focusing on the stars, for example, and you find infinity and you find that focus, that perfect focus, then you can just back it off and you can look at where the focus meter is. So the next one you take could be, you know, 256 meters, and you can work backwards from there all the way up to your very nearest near ground. And you'll see that, you know, the camera just, like the lens, it will move in increments. So you don't have to take 100 shots, but if you're at f2.8, you're probably going to take a lot of shots. So that's one way to do it. The other way is to use that Sony Commander that I talked about in the video, and that is such a powerful tool because it really takes the guesswork out for you. And so what I do there is I need to focus, I need to find my initial focus point, whether that's on the stars or whether that's on the foreground. So when I said you can set your camera to autofocus and you can shine a flashlight on it and you can hold the shutter halfway down, that's your focus point. So if your lens is in autofocus and your camera is in autofocus, you can use the remote just like you would the shutter button and find autofocus, as long as there's enough light on that object you're focusing on. Still with me?
Still with you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so you have a flashlight and you're going to use autofocus, and it's something in your near ground because that's how far your flashlight can reach. So whatever your nearest object is. So you get that first focal point. Then all you have to do is flip the camera into manual focus and you leave the lens in autofocus, and you can use the little step function on the remote. So you can work back to front or front to back with the plus sign and the minus sign, and it will just take one step at a time. And you can move 2 steps and take a shot. You can move 1 step and take a shot. So it makes it really easy to focus stack and not miss any of the focal point increments along the stack. Does that make sense?
It does. And I'm going to be talking to you after Be Alpha Live about putting together an article for us on Alpha Universe so we can really illustrate all of this out in detail.
Perfect. Well, it's a really good tool for night shooting. It's definitely saved me a lot of time. And a little bit of that panic that comes when you're trying to shoot something that's, you know, an aurora is a really good example because the sky is changing so much and you don't want to miss the shot. And you can actually, when you find your focus point in your near ground and you work up, it'll focus on infinity with that little remote. Like you'll hit infinity and then you know you're in focus. So it's a good tool as well for people who have visual problems like I do. I don't know, lots of people don't know this, but I am borderline legally blind in my left eye. So, you know, for me, these things, everybody assumes that it's easy for me, and it's definitely not easy. I have some pretty big visual impairments. And so little tools like this can really help when you struggle with, being able to just see your screen.
Definitely. And you and I have talked quite a bit in the past about using that bright monitoring for exactly the same kind of thing. The
Yeah.
bright monitoring feature is something that a lot of people don't necessarily know about in the Sony camera, but it's a menu function that you can set so that your LCD basically becomes like night vision, as you showed in the presentation.
Yeah.
But that's a great tool for, I mean, whether you're having vision problems like you and I do, or even if your vision is fine, because you are shooting at night after all.
Yeah. So typically what you would have to do, and I don't know if I explained this in my talk, but typically what we do when we go out in the middle of the night and we're trying to find a composition is we have to take a test shot. We have to open up the shutter, find 15 seconds, 30 seconds, depending on how much light we have, take a test shot, and then you hem and haw over, oh, should I move the camera, 2 inches to the right, or should it be lower, should it be higher, take another test shot, repeat the process. But bright monitoring eliminates that. And so when you're working with quickly changing conditions like aurora, it just takes, again, all the stress out of shooting, because you can go straight to finding your composition, and then you have little tools like the Sony Commander remote to do focus stacking, and life gets a lot easier.
Definitely. And Betty Griffin asked, hi, Rachel, great presentation. What do you use to find the position of the Milky Way to know your position in relation to what you want to shoot in the night sky?
So if you've ever seen any of my presentations, I pretty much talk about Photopills nonstop. I use Photopills for everything. So if you're ever curious about how to find the Milky Way, you can use that. It's an app, and you can search locations that you haven't been to before, or you can use the night AR function when you are on a location, and it'll show you exactly where the Milky Way is in relation to your landmark at a particular time of night. So I'm a big fan of Photopills. If you don't have it, that's an app that will change your night photography for sure.
Yeah, Photopills is really awesome. I'm glad you mentioned that. You talk about the 12 to 24 as being your new favorite lens. Can you talk a little bit more about why that lens has just kind of become your go-to?
Yeah. So part of it is, I live in this place where the landscapes are so grand, right? And it's difficult sometimes to get these grand landscapes into, a 16 millimeter shot. But that's just sort of like scratching the surface as to why that's a really great lens. I love the lens for the lens distortion. I talked about that in the video as well. It really helps you to create unique and compelling compositions in ways that, less wide angle lenses or standard wide angle lenses doesn't really afford. So I think as a compositional tool, it's just become such a favorite. And it's funny because, I had the opportunity to use the 14 and do some night sky photography. I miss those 2 millimeters, because I've had that 12 to 24 on my camera constantly. There's things that I love about the 14. It's faster and it's sharper, and so I don't want to be without it. But that 12 millimeters makes all the difference in the world when you're trying to compose a shot and you're working with big grand landscapes.
Definitely. And at a glance, 12 versus 14 sounds like a very small difference, but percentage-wise, if you start to look at it that way, it starts to become a pretty big difference. And we're talking about angle of view. That's exactly what you're talking about, is that percentage difference. So it's really pretty huge.
Yeah, it really, it's very noticeable, and it's hard not to go for the 12, like automatically, because it's just such a great lens. I do find for Astro that because it is so wide, you get just a little bit of elongation. The stars are still sharp, but they get just a tiny bit elongated in the corners. And that's what I would expect out of, something that's that wide of a field of view. And I've tried, in post to look at like lens correction and stuff like that. It doesn't really fix it. So the 14 is sharper for Astro. But the typical sort of like coma, the little birds that we get on when we're shooting stars on some lenses, that doesn't exist on the 12. It's just that tiny bit of elongation in the corners. And I think that's why I like it so much. And that it's wide, and that it's a compositional tool, and that it's versatile. And, it's just a great lens. It's so sharp.
We are live with Rachel Jones-Ross here at Be Alpha Live. We're taking your questions. Please put your questions in the chat. Rachel, I'm curious, we talked about bright monitoring as being a setting that you use. You talk about it in the presentation. You talk about some other camera settings. Are there any particular exposure settings that are like your go-tos when you're shooting at night?
That's a great question. And I would have to say no. The light changes more at night than it does during the day. And I know that sounds kind of crazy to think about, but typically if you're shooting during the daytime, you can shoot f8, f11. Those are kind of the sweet spots for getting, the most sharpness out of most lenses. So that's pretty standard. You can pretty much shoot anything at f8 to f11 during the day, but at night you can be shooting anything from f2.8 to f16 at the same location, trying to get the same shot, because you get more or less light with the moon. You get more or less light with urban glow, or a little bit of light pollution on the horizon. And so I think that if you were talking about shooting a particular kind of event, like aurora or Milky Way shooting, I could give you some sort of rough ballparks to chase for settings. But yeah, I think generally speaking, night shooting is very variable when it comes to the light. And it's not, you can't just go out and be like, okay, I'm going to, start off with ISO 3200 for 10 seconds. And, it doesn't translate from night to night.
Gotcha. We got a question from Leonardo, who lives in Chile, asking, saying, great talk, Rachel. What places in the world are on your bucket list for astro landscapes? Leonardo is an astronomer in Chile, so definitely start by recommending Chile as one of the darker skies in the world.
It is one of the darker skies in the world. And I was actually there for a 22-day trip, and it rained for 18 of them. And I got Milky Way shooting one night, and it was just like, so it's still on my bucket list to actually go there and get some good shots. It's on my bucket list to go to New Zealand for night shooting. I love seeing all the fields of lupins and the photos that I've looked at. And of course the mountains really call to me. So definitely want to do some more southern skies. And the aurora, I know I mentioned it in the presentation, but the activity on the sun is increasing. So we're entering a period that's moving towards solar maximum. So as time goes by, we're going to get more and more storms over the next few years on the sun, which is going to be more aurora activity. And I definitely have some places on my bucket list that I want to shoot that, including Finland, I haven't been to yet. And I'm going to the Yukon I'm going to the Yukon right after this presentation. And so I'm hoping to get some aurora shooting in while I'm there. Looks like I'm going to get lots of rain, so lots of moody photos, maybe not so many night photos, but yeah, there's a few places that really call to me.
When you're photographing the portraits and people under the stars, are those mostly single captures? Are they composites? How do you do those?
They're mostly more of a blend. So composite, typically, you're going to take a picture of somebody, then get a sky from somewhere else, and you're gonna put those things together. When I take photos of couples, I try to do my shot of the couples sort of during blue hour, when I still have some light and I can get a nice still pose out of them and get all that detail and less noise. And then I will leave the camera in place, and as the Milky Way comes up or that kind of thing, then I just leave the camera in place. So it's an easy blend, and it's very real to what they experience and what the moment is. But sometimes, composites are fun too. I have done a few of those, and I would say most of my workflow is a blend, though, where I just don't move the camera and I take photos. Think about it like a time blend. So I start with one type of light and I move into another type of light and I combine those together. But some of them are, single exposures as well, taken at night. It just depends on the ambient light that I have to work with.
Speaking of ambient light, you talked quite a bit about astronomical twilight and about how night shooting to you is not always about the stars or the Milky Way, but it can be just about that astronomical twilight period. Can you elaborate a little bit more on astronomical twilight and why you like it so much?
Yeah. It's the quality of the light. I've always found that my dreamiest images are ones that I have taken when I have a big moon low on the horizon during astronomical twilight. So if you look at Photopills, for example, you'll see that you'll get a sunset time, and then so it'll say sunset, blue hour, civil twilight, nautical twilight, and astronomical twilight. And I don't know how they calculate those different times, but astronomical twilight, you still have some light that's being reflected from the sun, and you still get some color typically. Kind of think about it like a second sunset, but there's stars out. And so after astronomical twilight is true nighttime. And so there's no light left from the sun whatsoever. And you might get moonlight, but my favorite combination or my favorite kind of light is that astronomical twilight with a big moon that's low on the horizon. And that only happens a few days of the month. So typically I'm looking for an elevation of the moon, and you can track this using Photopills, but the elevation of the moon would be somewhere between just the horizon and 20 degrees elevation. I've actually logged that and, watched, when I get a shot that I love and I've seen that kind of light, and then I record, what's going on, and I track that so that I can repeat so it's not just a one-time thing, and I can try and get the same kind of light another time.
You talked about how exposure is just going to be really dependent upon, exposure setting is going to be dependent upon the scene. But breaking down into ISO, is there an ISO range or an ISO actual value that you stick with?
No, I use a lot of different ranges. I think I think about it like this. If I'm going to do single exposure shooting, typically, before the Sony A7S III, I really didn't like to go beyond, say, 4,000 or 5,000 ISO. I know you can deal with the noise and stuff like that, but I'm a little bit particular. With the S3, an ISO 6400 shot, it looks so clean to me when I've applied a little bit of noise reduction that it kind of surprises me. So if I'm doing single exposure shots, 6400 is no problem for that camera. It handles it really well. And if I was, say, photographing the Milky Way and it was a really, really dark night, I'm probably going to be shooting at more like ISO 12,800 and taking multiple images to combine together for noise reduction.
We're here live with Rachel Jones-Ross talking about astrophotography. Taking your questions, please put your questions in the chat for Rachel. And we got a question about resources. What resources do you recommend for learning editing besides lots of practice with trial and error? So resources, tools.
Oh man, there's some really great resources out there. One of my favorite people for learning editing from has been Ryan Dyer. I don't know if you guys follow his work, but he's pretty amazing and he puts out some really great tutorials. I highly, highly, highly recommend Ryan Dyer. Joshua Snow does lots of tutorials as well. He's kind of a Photoshop wizard, so recommend him. Mark Adamus has been an influence in my career, and he has very unique techniques. He offers 2-day-long seminars on processing, so I think he would be another amazing resource. There's so many, but I guess those are my sort of top 3 that I would say right now.
Are there any particular software solutions that you think are must-haves for anyone getting into astrophotography?
Yeah, I don't know if the audience has tried the Topaz suite. I've tried Topaz Denoise AI, and it's fantastic. I really like that. It just takes the noise reduction to a whole new level. Being able to use Starry Landscape Stacker to stack, say, 20 images for noise reduction. That's another very game-changing software for astrophotographers. I also like the Topaz Gigapixel because basically I can take my 12 megapixel file from my Sony A7S III and I can make that 4 times bigger. So or more. I don't know. I haven't tried more, but you can upsize a photo, and it doesn't really matter what kind of resolution you start with. You can still get a really amazing image. So,
do you ever use a physical sky tracker, like a
yes.
A tracking mount? Which one do you use?
So I have one by Slick. I don't remember what it's got a number on it. It's a small unit though, and what I love about it. So this is made by Slick USA. It's basically the size of a lens. So, when I'm backpacking and stuff like that, I can take it with me, and, it's not a lot of weight and it's not a lot of space in my bag. You have to basically manually align it. I have a really strong laser flashlight that I can use to align it. And yeah, I think they're really fun to use and highly recommend.
We have just a couple minutes left, and I'm curious, for people who are new to astrophotography, really kind of getting maybe a little bit overwhelmed by all the different aspects of it and really want to break into it, is there a piece of advice that you could give or a recommendation?
My favorite piece of advice is to just do what you love. I think when you're doing what you love, the effort and the suffering, if you will, of being out in the cold or with the mosquitoes or whatever the case may be, it doesn't seem like effort. So, go shoot what you love, and definitely practice makes things a lot easier. Getting to know your gear before you go out in the field. So, it's hard to find all your buttons and everything at night, and it can be a little bit frustrating, but if you take the time to get to know your camera and know where the buttons are that you're going to need. So your shutter, your aperture, your ISO, maybe your 2-second timer, being able to change your settings in the dark without having to turn a flashlight on is going to help a lot. And it will help you to make friends a lot easier than if you're turning on a flashlight. Also being able to look at your review, so your playback and magnifying your playback. Those are things that are really good to know where they are before you head out to shoot, and it'll make your life easier.
Before we wrap up, we got a question about upcoming workshops. Do you have any upcoming workshops with Jess now with Jess in Calgary now that the borders are open?
None with Jess in Calgary. I do have one coming up with Jess in Death Valley at the end of October, and it's Astro-focused, so it'll be a fun one. And and it's actually a really good time of night to do it, or a good time of year to do it, because as soon as the sun goes down, the Milky Way is up. And so it means you actually get to sleep, and you don't have to wait till 3 o'clock in the morning for the right position and all that kind of stuff. So if you're looking for a fun night photography workshop, the Death Valley one, it'll be nice, pleasant temperatures and easy nighttime shooting.
Rachel, thanks so much for being here on Be Alpha Live. Thanks to our audience for all the great questions, and thanks again.
All right, thanks so much for having me, Chris.